Well, no surprise that the person matters within healthcare. From the front door to the front door of triage to the executive suite, it's becoming more and more evident that the person really matters in how we deliver healthcare. Today, for the Ford's Workforce Chat, for the next one in the series, I'm joined with Lisa Davies-Jones, who is an executive healthcare leader on a mission to bring back the person within healthcare. We've known each other for a few years now, and I'm pleased to have a chat with her about her thoughts on healthcare and what that means in this new age. How are you, Lisa?
I'm great, thank you, Atul. How are you?
Very good, very good.
Very good.
It's lovely to sit down in front of the camera,
Yeah.
sitting here and having a chat that we have been doing. The first question that I'd be really keen to ask you is, how did you get into the business that is healthcare?
Well, I started as a student nurse. So in terms of how I made that choice, I think back then I knew I wanted to do something where I was going to have a chance to work with people, and nursing really just gives you a great opportunity to have a real diversity of career. My dad was a general practice GP. Spent a lot of time going on calls with him and understanding what the role of a doctor was. But I think I chose nursing because I particularly wanted to be able to spend time with the patient and to really make a difference one-on-one. So that's how I started. In terms of how I got to where I've got now, from student nursing, I obviously went up the career ladder, as it were, the way that we all do as of nurses. I find it tremendously rewarding being a team leader. So, but I think in the role of a nurse unit manager, which is where, obviously the first time you really step into a significant leadership role, although as a nurse I think you're a leader in every role. I mean, I'm sure we'll have some chance to talk about that. But I think I found it tremendously rewarding working as a leader of a team and being able to make a difference to that team and to make a difference to the people in our unit. But there were some frustrations about the way that the system worked. So I was a nurse unit manager of a large and very busy surgical ward. And patients would turn up on the wrong day because the letter told them to turn up on that day, or they didn't get a letter, and they'd turn having had nothing to eat or drink for 8 or 9 or 10 hours, and I knew that they had another 10 hours before they were going to have their surgery. So there were things in terms of the way that the system worked, which were not person-centred or patient-centred. And I saw some real opportunities to be able to make a difference to the patient pathway. So when there was an opportunity to go into modernisation and service improvement, because there was some investment in that in the NHS when I was working over across the water in the UK. I applied for one of those roles and really got into the business of, as I say, service improvement, working across the hospital. And I thoroughly enjoyed it. And I just saw what an opportunity you had through just looking at the way that we design our pathways and design the way that we communicate with patients and people who are coming in for care, and the way that we organise our work across different service areas, across different professions, that by being thoughtful about the person at the centre, you could make a huge difference to their experience. And I got a huge amount of satisfaction from that. And you get the opportunity to put some changes in place that are actually are sustainable if you do it well, as you say, in a person-centred way. So that's then took me into more senior roles in that environment of managing services. So went into general management type roles and also clinical governance type roles, because obviously it's about the quality of care and the way that we govern and manage the risk, because healthcare is a really complex, adaptive system. And I'm sure we'll have an opportunity to talk further about, why that matters, the way we think about healthcare and the way we think about people. So that's how I got into it. And as I say, I just kept taking the next step in terms of how can I help? How can I make things better? How can I help the staff, the team I work with, and how can I help the people who I'm there to care for? And I suppose that ultimately ended with me taking on, as I say, executive roles in operations and clinical governance, and then the chief executive roles, which has been tremendously rewarding. And obviously every step of the way has been about making a difference and using, I suppose, the role to influence and make things better. So yeah.
It's quite a journey, and you've definitely got some strong nursing values there, and it's fantastic to see your journey. I guess a question that I was thinking of when you were speaking then is, did you find any challenges with those values? The values that you really speak strongly with, those contribution and making an impact, and supporting and helping people. Yeah. Did you often find those challenges with getting into a system that is not always, has to produce an outcome? Was those barriers there often, and which parts of your career, because you probably felt them differently at the executive level versus a nurse manager level?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think I've reflected a lot on this. So at the level of being a clinical nurse, you walk into work to your shift, and you can have really tough days, but there's one thing you get, and that's immediate gratification for the difference you've made. You see, you're with a person, with the patients, the family, and because of your engagement, when you do it well, it makes a difference to them. What I found is, as soon as you go into management and leadership roles where you're not having direct care, you get your role satisfaction in a different way in terms of helping the team, your team, or making differences to the service so that it's better for the patient and their families. So in terms of challenges, I think the first one is when and every clinician will experience this, that there's a huge difference to looking after either a patient and doing what's best for that patient, so being person-centered, and then doing the best and thinking about how you do the best for a service or a group of patients. So, and you'll be in that, you'll have that experience. So when you are in a leadership role, you have to make judgments about how much time you're going to allocate to this patient versus this patient, and how you're going to ensure that, because obviously there's always time constraints, and no matter how efficient you are, there will always be more to do than you've got time to do. And whatever efficiencies you make will get filled up, because that's just the way of life. So getting used to that ability to accept, I suppose, that there's always a balance. There's a risk, an opportunity balance to everything you do. So that's the first thing that I experienced was, wow, I'd love to do the best thing as a nurse unit manager. I'd love to do the best thing for each and every individual member of staff, but I can't. So that means that everyone's going to have their days off that they requested. Not everyone's going to have the perfect roster, because you can't do that and deliver a sustainable service. And also, as I say, you have to think about how you allocate time to ensure that it's used as effectively as you can. Then, as you move up, the next challenge for me was how long it can take you to make a difference. So you move into a role, you're given objectives, you give and obviously the freedom to make the decisions about how you're going to do this work as you get more senior. And I suppose the challenge with that is, I suppose that you may have the opportunity to decide how best to go about delivering on whatever objective you need to improve the service. But the reality is you can't do it alone. And that's a really big lesson, is how do you work with people and build relationships so that you can actually influence the agenda and make a difference. And I think a big frustration for people going into leadership roles, and certainly into middle management roles, is that it's not about position. Because if you only rely on your position to get things done, you'll hit roadblocks. And you'll get frustrated, and you probably won't be as successful as you would be if you actually start with the people and think about relationships and think about what's in it for every person who needs to be involved in any change or improvement. So that's the next constraint, and that's a big learning, I think, in terms of that level. And then you go up to the next level where it's not just about your organisation or your team or your groups of teams. It becomes about how you're going to work at the level of your organisation. So let's just take health. So if you're in the acute hospital environment and you want to do something to change the pathways for people with chronic disease, well, you're not going to do it without engaging actively with primary care and in terms of understanding, and also not-for-profit sector, care sector, in terms of understanding how you're going to change pathways. Because if we keep doing more of the same, we will simply just run out of budget and funding and beds.
Yes.
And it doesn't matter how many more beds we build, there'll never be enough. So
Exactly
I think you then get to that point where you have to think about how do you work with partners and with like-minded stakeholders to find the win-win in working together to make things better. So those are the key messages. It's just at every point that you go from team level to service
Step
level,
by step,
to organisational level, and then to regional level in terms of working across organisation. And it takes thought and it takes consideration about what skills you bring to the table and how you're going to develop those skills to ensure you're effective.
Yes, absolutely. And unique challenges in each level because there's different problems in different stages, isn't there? I'm interested in the translation of values and how we can support staff at those different levels. And you've got a perfect person to talk to that because you've incrementally gone to those steps. Because I think, if you are supporting an individual staff member, well, that's fine. But how do you do that to the next level, to the next level, to then an organisation-wide? How can we support our staff from afar? And have you had any success stories of supporting staff that has supported them to keep turning up to work?
Yeah, okay, so that's a really, really important point because, as I say, as a team leader, you have the ability to directly influence the well-being of your team and the culture of your team, and values are really important to that. I think in terms of value, I'll start with the values piece because I think part of undertaking any one of those roles at whatever level of the organisation or system you're at, your values are really important, and obviously in terms of your decision making and where you spend your time and how you prioritise, we all start with our values, and they obviously from them they form our beliefs, and then they form our behaviours, don't they? And we know that. So I think for me personally, my values have helped me to manage challenging situations, and I think, as you say, values are really important in terms of culture and the well-being of staff, and also values I think become really important in terms of challenging times as well.
Sticking together,
and sticking
teamwork,
together.
yes.
So I think in terms of influencing well-being of staff when you're talking at an organisational level, I think the values are really important. That's where you start. So I'd say you start with, well, what are our values and what are our shared values? And I think the first thing, and I have done this in organisations that I've worked in, several levels. It's really important the way you're thinking about your values and your strategy and your plan for the future, that you start with a shared engagement process with staff around values and make it meaningful and authentic. So that's where you start.
And action-based too, because
Absolutely.
many organisations have the classic trust, teamwork. Well, that's what I value, but they're very firm words, I guess. And one thing I will share is that we connected. I worked underneath you in an organisation, and you sent out an email that was very value based, and I reached out to you for a conversation. I think that's how we first met, because you shared some of that passion and that value mission in some of the words you emailed out, and I think that's really powerful. And would you recommend others to do that? Like, it was to take every moment to share what their values and be a little bit vulnerable in that space as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's really important. I think you hit the nail on the head there in terms of, with values comes action. So whenever we think about our values, we need to be able to describe what that means, as you say. So what does trust mean? So having a couple of sentences that actually help people to relate to that value within the organisation contextually, I think is really important. And as you say, as a leader, sharing those values in conversations, discussions, meetings, and as you say, emails when you have the opportunity to do newsletters and weekly shout-outs. So yeah, I think it's really important. And yes, vulnerability of leaders is really important, because I think sharing something about yourself, I think then helps to build trust and human contact between people. So for sure, I think it's really important. So certainly I think that's a starting point in terms of those values and living them. There's nothing worse, is there, than having values which you then see your leaders not following. And I think what's really important is that people feel safe to call it. I've always said that, I think the sign of a really successful organisation is one where people do feel comfortable to call out, very professionally and kindly. And kindness is a really important value to me. That's, there's things we need to do, but we can always do it kindly. But I think to kindly call out where we think people aren't living values, and to hold each other to account for that. I think that leadership really actively supports and encourages that and walks the talk. I think that's important. So I think that's the second step. So values, and then actually making sure that we deliver on them and that people are rewarded and recognised. So I think, celebration is important.
Absolutely. Yes.
So where some
feeling successful.
Feeling successful. So really ensuring that at every level in the organisation, the team gets to give a shout out to someone in the team who's done some great work, and they get recognised and acknowledged, and that we celebrate that, I think, and that we take time to celebrate it, and not just assume that that's what's expected. So I think that's a really another really important part. And then obviously the one that's always a sensitive is that when for people is when you don't feel safe, or when you're concerned that your patients aren't safe or other members of staff aren't safe, that there is a mechanism through which people can get their voices heard, because that will always happen in any organisation. So putting your mechanisms in place so that there's ability for people to raise things safely, and that they see things are being I suppose reviewed, and that they get feedback in terms of what's been done and what's been considered. So I think feedback is really important on any aspect. So where we ask for feedback from staff, that we actually are respectful in terms of thanking them, and also providing information on what's been done, really, about that feedback. Yeah, so those are the key things I think, Atul. And then in terms of, I'm sure we could spend hours talking about well-being, couldn't we? But as I say, it does start with safety.
Yes, and I think
for sure. I mean, that's the bottom of the hierarchy, isn't it? In terms of our hierarchy of needs, is feeling safe. And then once you've got that in place, obviously the next thing is that people feel valued, and that they're actually happy at work, and people can feel valued and feel safe, but still feel as if there's the burden of what's expected of them is just enormous, and that they're exhausted, and that their work-life balance isn't really being considered. So,
but I think what is really important from a burnout perspective is that if you do have those two firm pillars in place, you've got a platform to then change things incrementally. If you don't have those platforms, it's really difficult to look back on events or look back and think, well, how can we change when you don't have certainty, you don't feel safe, you don't have that psychological freedom to be yourself, but also you don't feel valued. And I think that's one of the things that we're seeing quite often now, and you'll see in the NHS and around the world strikes, nurses and doctors are striking, and not feeling valued, and it's very much an important value that we need to live by. And one thing I will ask too is, with Queensland, actually Victoria, many states are implementing psychological safe legislation.
Okay.
How do you see that being applied? Do you see that as a good move in the right direction, or do you think there'll be some challenges with applying that?
I just think it's sad that we have to apply legislation to something so fundamental, really, isn't it? I mean, it's interesting, and I think it's like any legislation, it's a blunt tool, and it's a minimum standard. And I always think when you get to the point where you have to apply a minimum standard, in some ways it can drag things down and not up. So, but that's just my own personal view. I think the legislation, I suppose, it's a bit like any fair workplace legislation. It's about saying that these are the standards that we live to, and that there's an expectation that people, that staff are protected through that legislation. But I haven't actually seen the legislation in Victoria, so I don't know. But I think in terms of the application, it would be through the Fair Work legislation, I'm assuming. I just, as I say, I think it's a challenge, isn't it? Because what we want is that we can focus on continuous improvement and engagement and capability. But yeah, I think often legislation comes into play where there are issues, and they're intractable issues that cannot be resolved through incentivization and policy, really. So
it's certainly watch this space sort of thing in the next year or so to see what happens in that space. And I guess, what are some of the big workforce challenges you're seeing moving forward? And we've spoken a lot about values and how we can support staff from afar. Do you see any big workforce challenges, and how do you see us overcoming them? Because they're here with us, and they're unfortunately going to continue for a little bit of time.
I think it's really interesting because in terms of Australia, let's talk about Australia rather than global at the moment. But
yes,
for us, particularly here in Queensland, the population is going to age, and we're going to have more and more people beyond, in retirement age, living longer, but needing care. So that means there'll be more people over over 65 than there are people available to work, unless obviously there's some rapid growth in terms of our migration and bringing people in from other countries. But as other countries are actually facing similar issues, it's going to be more and more difficult, I think. So I think the challenge for us is the fact that the workforce is potentially going to continue to shrink, and the burden, I suppose, the health burden is going to increase. So how do we address that? And I think we've got huge potential to address it through. So I think the other thing, of course, with Queensland is we've got the geographic challenge. So we already know how difficult it is to recruit and retain staff in remote Queensland particularly, and it's not necessarily about the experience, because people love being in those communities. I mean, I've been in them myself and worked in them myself, and it's a fantastic sense of community. You get a sense of achievement in terms of the work that you do, and you're very, very valued by those communities. But people find it difficult to live there long term if you've got young families and you're not necessarily from the community. So it's a big commitment. So I think we really do need to think about technology for sure. I think there's a lot we can do by really optimizing access to virtual healthcare, and we haven't come anywhere near to, I think, optimizing the potential, and in terms of wearable devices, in terms of providing prevention, coaching, doing all the things that can actually keep people well and active and healthy and happy for longer. And I think that focus on prevention is really important, and finding ways to invest up front and thinking about children and the generational impact you can have by ensuring kids are eating really well and that they're healthy and they're active. So I do think we need to think about prevention, because we can't continue to have to intervene when people have got chronic disease. And then we need to think about how technology assists in terms of those geographic challenges, and remembering that doesn't mean just technology use of clinicians in Australia. We can think about how technology can then help us to tap into that worldwide workforce. I think that's something we need to consider.
Well, we have to look at the whole pond, don't we?
Absolutely.
Because the whole pond is in deficit. So, but we have to consider the whole ecosystem.
Sure.
Yeah.
I think the other thing is, if you look to futurists, I mean, obviously the development of technology means that people can they can access so much fantastic information now through the internet in terms of their health and well-being, and so I think that's certainly going to change the roles of doctors, nurses, allied health workers, all staff across the professional basis. So it's thinking about what that looks like for the future. But I think another thing that's happened over the last 30, 40, 50 years is the specialisation. And I think we really need to think about that we need generalists. We're going to need more and more generalists, particularly as technology takes over. And what does that mean to the way we train people, and what do professions look like in the future? So I think there's huge opportunities to think differently. But obviously that's something that needs to be worked through with the professional groups and with staff. But yeah,
it is challenging, because we have to think differently, but our system is based on certainty. Healthcare is we don't implement a new intervention until we're really certain, because we have to deliver it in a certain way, and obviously a lot of our organisations are made in that frame of thinking. So it is one of those challenges, and coming from a founder who has a startup in healthcare, it is a challenge to move to that next step, because we value certainty so high in healthcare. Well, thank you for joining me here today, Lisa, and it's a great pleasure to speak with you on some of these important topics. Do you have any final thoughts that you want to share? And where can people reach out to you? Can they reach out to you on LinkedIn? Is that all right?
Of course it is, yeah. I think in terms of final thoughts, as you said at the beginning, it is all about the people. And I think the other thing that's really fundamental is, in order for people for staff at the pointy end, which is basically with the patients, to be able to look after patients, their family and their community, we need to look after them because it's fundamental, and I think it's really important. So as a leader, I think as long as we look after staff, the staff will look after the patients and the community. So, and I think that's would be my clear message. And the second part is that the answers are all there with the people who spend their time at the front line. Mm-hmm. They have great ideas, and I think what we need to do is be able to free people up to give things a try, as you said, Atul, and find ways of supporting innovation so that people can actually have the resources to give things a try. So yeah. And yes, certainly people can contact me through LinkedIn. I'm there, and I'm very happy to chat to anyone. Thank you for this opportunity.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Well, that was excellent, and I really appreciated that chat with Lisa today. And I look forward to the next opportunity where I discuss with another leader some of the workforce challenges that we're seeing within healthcare.